Hey there, leaders. Thank you for joining me today. So, for most of you, if you've heard me before, you've heard me talk about imposter syndrome. And I'm sure many of you have heard the term, you've read a blog, you've read a newsletter, you've seen a social media post, maybe something even on Instagram or LinkedIn about it. And so, what we know is that imposter syndrome is essentially the unsubstantiated feeling that you're not qualified to do what you're doing. And the truth is, many of us experience it. It happens a lot. When you land a big client, do you instantly freak out, wondering if you're going to nail it, just like you have for your past projects? Do you worry about presenting to investors, thinking there's no way you're prepared enough for them to hand over millions of dollars? Well, guess what? You're not alone. And I know you know that. But did you know that stats and data show 82% of people report experiencing imposter syndrome in their work? While it is common and many of us experience it, and I'd be hard pressed not to believe that all of us have experienced it in one way or another, the question becomes, how do we overcome it? How do we get over it? How do we push past it? How do we heal from it? Well, today's guest is going to be sharing some nuggets and some wisdom on how to do just that. Suzanne McColl is a therapist. She is also a speaker and author, and she specializes in trauma mostly, but she also deals with individuals who, based on their trauma, are, overcome or have been overcome with imposter syndrome, and helps them create coping mechanisms that allow them to move past that moment of fear and that moment of anxiety to really create more healthy language and a more healthy identity. So with that, I know you are going to have a lot of major takeaways from this episode. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the content. Thank you for joining me on another episode of She Leads Now podcast, where we help career and entrepreneurial women gain the tools to develop a success mindset, create winning strategies, build collaborative relationships, and take bold action towards creating impact and fulfillment in their lives and careers. I'm your host, Sabine Gideon, and I'm on a mission to awaken and activate women and emerging leaders so they can tap into their innate leadership ability, elevate their influence, and create the impact they were destined to make. If you're ready to up-level your confidence, courage, and influence, you've come to the right place. Join me weekly for insights, strategies, and resources to help you grow, develop, and embody the leader you are meant to be, so that you can make the impact you know you are called to make and establish the legacy you've always dreamed. The world eagerly awaits the emergence of your brilliance, impact, and influence. So with that, let's dive into this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of She Leads Now. I am your host, Sabine Gideon, and today I am thrilled to be sharing this conversation with the lovely Suzanne McColl. Suzanne is a licensed professional counselor, a motivational speaker, a transformational therapist, and an author. She's also a notable EMDR therapist located in my home state of Connecticut. Suzanne, I am so excited to have you here and to have this conversation. And please, if you would, share with us a little bit about you, your background, and your journey to becoming this amazing therapist and coach.
Thank you, Sabine. It's great to be here. As you said, I'm a therapist, and I've been a therapist most of my life. I do right now work in New York, Connecticut, and Florida, but mostly Connecticut. And I do trauma work mostly with EMDR. That's what it's really so great with. And got here mostly because I've been kind of, taking many steps in my journey and working on, okay, what do I need to learn next that would help me to grow more? And each step of the way, I found really cool techniques and therapies and was able to start using them with my clients. So about 5 years ago, I was working somewhere full time, and there was a director position available, and I knew that I could do that job. And I put my hat in the ring, and it was like I was invisible, like I wasn't really there. Like nobody was listening, nobody was taking me seriously. And at that point, it triggered a lot of my own feelings of not being worthy, not being good enough. And I really started to really work on it. And I decided I had to leave that job and take that leap, go out on my own, be a total entrepreneur, and really work on strengthening my feelings about myself. And that's how I really started to make that my focus with women who are also entrepreneurs. And that's kind of my journey.
Awesome. And thank you for sharing that. I did not know that that was the catalyst for you transitioning into the space. And so that's awesome that you took your own journey, your own personal journey and your learnings. And now you've been using it for years now to support others in your own practice. And so we're going to talk about a little bit more about those feelings of not enough and the imposter syndrome and from the perspective of a therapist, what that looks like on the other side and what actually overcoming that can look like. But one of the things that I'm curious about that I know about you as well is that you've owned and maintained your practice for quite some time, which is a triumph all in itself. Talk to us about that journey transitioning from, being an employee to I'm going to take this leap, I'm going to start my business, to now having grown this sustainable organization that you have.
Yeah, it was a step-by-step journey until it was a big leap because I was working full time and I was too afraid. I wasn't confident enough to go out on my own. So I went out on my own while I kept my job. And then I took on another position of doing private practice. So I was doing all that private practice work, but playing it safe by keeping my day job. And then when it came to that time when I was basically told I wasn't enough, that I said, I've got to take the leap. And it was really scary to be on my own and supporting myself. And I really, there were a lot of learning lessons in terms of how to run a business, how to pay the taxes so that you don't end up having to pay them back after, and how to everything, the marketing. At first, I used to think I'm making all this money. I could spend a lot of money on all this stuff, but I really didn't know how to create a budget and a business plan. So that's when I started having coaches, and that really helped me a lot. I remember when I first got my accountant and he helped me all my bookkeeping. I thought he was like an angel. It was like, oh my God, it felt really good. And so I worked on my own. And then after a couple of years, I thought, I kind of want to work with other people. So I opened a group practice and I started to build that. And that was another whole challenge in itself, with learning how to manage other people, give them their independence, but also, be a manager. And, some of the imposter syndrome stuff came up then. How can I be the one that does this? But it did work and it kept growing. And so now it's pretty successful. It's probably, mid six-figure income. Plus I have another business now where it's more a solo practice where I do speaking and writing and workshops and sort of VIP sessions with people via telehealth. So I have two businesses now. And it's just been a learning process every step of the way.
Oh, wow. That is amazing and impressive at the same time. And to your point about the accountant, I think anyone who has been blessed with the desire and the skill set to do bookkeeping, finance in any capacity, they are doing God's work. So, so yes, I appreciate that. And thank you so much for kind of sharing that step-by-step journey and how you've navigated that. And so the focus for today is really around imposter syndrome, because that is your zone of genius. And that is where you've helped so many, women and continue to help others in that space or overcome that trouble. And I before we get into how you are helping others navigate that, I pulled some quick stats that I wanted to share with the audience. 75% of executive women report having personally experienced imposter syndrome at certain points in their career, and 85% believe imposter syndrome is commonly experienced by women in corporate America. Large numbers, expected 100. And reason being, whether you're an executive woman climbing up the ladder or you're starting a business, we all have those periods in our lives or in those moments where, our mind will start to play tricks on us and will start to make us believe that we're not ready, we're not capable, we don't have the skill set, we don't have the pedigree, whatever it is, whatever that inner critic is sharing with you. And so today, I want to really talk through, not necessarily what is imposter syndrome, because I do believe that we've heard it in the media enough, and I've certainly talked about it enough to the audience, but really beyond the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions, right, that we recognize as the symptoms, underneath it all, what is the root? What is at the root of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think it comes from a few different places: society, cultural expectations and values and beliefs for women, for example, what they can do and can't do, whether it's okay to be leaders or not. So societal stuff, but family things that your parents take on and they pass on, and whether they say it or not, they're showing it, right? Like about women not being being able to be leaders. It's a lot of it has to do with being leaders and being able to speak what you have to say, your opinions about things. And so it's like what the role model's been. But it's also, there's a lot of trauma that happens with people. And what happens is when they kind of deal with it their whole life in one way or another. And a lot of people who have had trauma tend to be pretty high achievers. They don't feel good enough, so they're working on getting approval, and they really work hard at it. Like perfectionism, it's all about not letting people see who you think you really are, that fear, that belief that you're not good enough. And then when you get put into a situation where, you might be an executive and you might be a woman with all these men, perhaps, around the table, and all those beliefs about yourself come full-fledged, they get triggered. And the reason why they're getting triggered is because they haven't been processed. Because when we have trauma, it goes to the part of your brain where it just gets kind of tucked away and it doesn't get processed. It's more in the lower part of the brain where we have emotions and reflexes. So, but when you get into these situations where you're qualified, you get hired, you're definitely qualified, but you just feel like you don't belong and you don't fit in because you're different than everybody. It gets triggered, that imposter syndrome.
Absolutely. And you make so many points here. And so you talked about some of the places and where those seeds are sown are societal, obviously family situations, spoken, unspoken. And then you mentioned trauma. And I think it's important to kind of highlight that, because many of us are so familiar with trauma in the sense of, verbal abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse. And so, what we associate trauma with is like some of these like really, really ugly things, right, that happen to people. Doing some research, I learned that, trauma is not necessarily just the thing that happened. It doesn't have to be abuse in that capacity, but it's the meaning that we give to or identify with whatever an incident is that can create trauma in us. And so I'm curious, in your expertise, because you're the expert here, what are some of the unknown like trauma examples so that we can kind of like, I don't know, illuminate and what's the word that I'm looking for?
Make sense of?
Not make sense of, but there's a lot of shame that's usually attached to, trauma. So to kind of like just take some of that away and make it a little bit more commonplace.
Yeah, destigmatize, normalize it. I don't know anybody who hasn't had some kind of a trauma that happens. And so trauma is a noun, but it's also an experience, right? Like it's how we experience what happens to us. So the same thing could happen to two different people, but somebody helps them through it. And so it doesn't create an ongoing trauma experience. So there's the things that happen, the hidden traumas. There's big T and little t. We all know about the big T traumas, right? The little T traumas are things like your parents fighting, your parents getting divorced. Our parents are human, so they were raised by their parents who were had all sorts of things. Maybe somebody doesn't feel comfortable with showing emotions. And so your mother or father was kind of distant, and you experience that as like there's something wrong with me, I'm not lovable. That's trauma. And that's like a really simple thing, and it's really common. One of your siblings is sick, so they get a lot of attention. That could be traumatic for one of the kids in the family if they end up always getting pushed aside because they're doing fine, right? That could be trauma. If a kid at school bullies you, that could be trauma. If you lose an animal, a pet in your childhood that you're really attached to, and nobody really helps you through that emotionally, that could be something that stays with you. I had a bus driver that looked at me funny when I was in school, when I was little. And I felt like violated. And that created some trauma. And if you have little things like that, walking down the street and somebody catcalling you can make you feel unsafe. All these little things are so important. I have so many clients, like young adults now, it's closer to them. So they're talking about like friend situations where they get like kind of ostracized from the lunch table. You broke up with one boy, somebody else went out with them, and now nobody knows how to handle it. So they just don't talk to you. These are things that stay with you, and they can cause trauma.
Yeah.
And it goes on.
Yeah. Thank you for those examples, both adolescence all the way to adulthood and the things that happen. And thank you for clarifying what trauma is and what it looks like and the experience, because I think some people who experience imposter syndrome, when you say it's rooted in not feeling like enough or it's rooted in trauma, their mindset can go to, well, I've never been abused. I've never had these things. But again, it's the meaning that we attach to it, and it's how it's stored, right, in our memory bank. I know from firsthand experience, having experienced big T and little t, the process of undoing and facing and healing and moving forward is, one, painful. And it can be a long process depending on how much big T and little t that you've had. So if you wouldn't mind, walk us through, for someone who is listening, who, some of your examples really resonated with them, what are some of the beginning steps that they can take to move through or even just create awareness of whatever's been stored?
Yeah. Well, I mean, awareness is understanding what trauma is and how your brain works when you have trauma is so helpful. Like, for example, knowing that like when you feel like you can't think straight and you can't find the words when you're like in a meeting or something, and you can start to say to yourself, oh, that's a trauma reaction. I must be feeling uncomfortable right now. Because when you go into those trauma reactions, you're in fight or flight, and then you're not thinking clearly, you're just reacting. So helping people to be able to identify what the symptoms are when you have trauma is very helpful. Knowing how to look at a situation and say, what do I believe about myself when I think about this situation? What's the negative thought? And, it might be like, I'm not enough, or I'm not safe. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I used to have that one a lot. I'm not interesting. And then you have to challenge yourself and say, well, what is the evidence? Like, find what is the evidence, but also where does that come from? Like, So what I do is I help people say to go back in their life and ask themselves and notice when they first started to have those kinds of feelings about themselves. And chances are it's a familiar feeling. I don't know about you, but what my experience with people and even myself is we all struggle with a basic thing, a basic belief about ourselves. And that tends to keep coming up in different situations. So most of my clients, when I say, well, when did you first feel that? They're like, oh, I know exactly when I started to feel that way, or oh, I've been feeling that way my whole life, So trying to separate that out, like it's not maybe about the here and now, it's really maybe more about the past.
Right. And so a couple things that you said there was to, one, identify the symptoms and of course the triggers, and then, get to the root of where is that negative thought coming from, or what is that negative thought? And so, I think that that's so important for us. I usually challenge it with, is that true? But I think the other piece too, in that, having had to do this work is, identifying the symptoms and the triggers is one thing. Being willing or being okay with being vulnerable with yourself, right? With the information that comes back. I think that sometimes that can be the place, or at least for me, that can be the place where I am immediately, repelled, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I think that, or that can't be my thought, right? So how do you work through, as you're trying to work through the process of, creating that self-compassion and giving yourself that grace to really process whatever information is coming back to you without judging and without shutting down before you can move towards healing?
I think that's one of the hardest things is to know that if you have these deep feelings, or just to be able to witness yourself from the past, is one of the hardest things to do. And I think it often takes having somebody help you through it as a therapist, because it's confusing. You don't really understand. There's a lot of questions about, was it really my fault? What happened? Or was it me? Or people don't like to see themselves the way they think of themselves, so that it's hard to even look. So I always tell people, like, whatever your coping mechanism was, think of it as as if it was one of your children, or like think of somebody who's young that whatever they do, they're just trying to be loved, really. And they deserve love. We all deserve love. So think about yourself the way you would your best friend, or the way you would one of your relatives, like one of your nieces and nephews, or your children, and try to have that be how you look at yourself, with compassion, because having that compassion is really important.
So, or at least when I see imposter syndrome in blogs, in articles, in newsletters, it is really geared around women, right? And so it's almost like this label that, we identify that we all may experience it, but it feels like it's just targeted towards women. And so for someone, a woman particularly, who is at the space where maybe they've identified with imposter syndrome, what are some thoughts around how they can, again, separate them from whatever the thought or the feeling or the emotion or the trigger is telling them in that moment?
Yeah, they have to kind of try to compose themselves, stop, take a breath, notice what their thoughts are, come up with some kind of an affirmation that they can tell themselves, like, I don't have to be perfect. Nobody's perfect. Notice, tell them to look around at everybody else. And what do you think of them? Do you think they're perfect? And do you value them? And tell them to think about how they deserve to have that grace also. They don't have to be perfect either. I think that just as many men have imposter syndrome as women, and just to kind of remind themselves that. that everybody is really trying to just come across as successful as they can, and not to try to look at themselves as the same as everybody else. It's really tough.
And so I find it interesting that you shared that, one of the strategies could be to kind of look around at others, and really question, is that person perfect? And I feel like in some ways that could be the fine line between like really letting your inner critic eat at you, or getting to that place. So how do you walk that tight line of looking at others and seeing that they're just as equally trying to figure it out as you, without overstepping and falling into that comparison trap?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, you have to just keep telling yourself that what they're not showing is probably a lot of their own insecurities, and they probably can't see mine either. And that we're all human. Like, I mean, just trying to like look underneath the surface, and that we all have our own insecurities, and maybe they're not the same as mine, but I know they have them. And the other thing I tell people is to try to think of somebody, a mentor or somebody that you really look up to, who has been able to show you that, they have a lot of expertise and knowledge, but they're not perfect. And imagine them there with you. So imagine them there sitting next to you saying, you're doing a great job. You're doing great. You have so many great skills. You have so much to offer. And just having that imaginary person with you can really help you not to feel alone, and to help you be calmer. Because it's when you start to let that anxiety and panic take over that you can't think straight. And then you don't say what you're supposed to say the right way. It's like a self-sabotage, self-fulfilling prophecy.
I love that idea of, finding someone who you admire and who you respect, and really leveraging that as a way to kind of move away from whatever anxious thoughts that you may be having. And so with imposter syndrome, again, because it's so attached to women, there's this Harvard Business Review article that talks about how imposter syndrome isn't really the issue, but it's really the way that the business world, if you will, is set up, and how, the world at large is set up. And so what are your thoughts there? Like, do you agree that it's really the environment?
I think it's both. I don't think we can get away from that. But I think that, and that's a good thing to remind yourself, like there's systemic discrimination maybe against women in these kinds of environments. And it's a process that we all have to work on. But I also think that if you have a really good sense of who you are, and you feel strong about yourself, and you don't have unresolved conflicts and traumas, then you can kind of see that more clearly. So whatever we can do to just kind of work on ourselves, men and women. I have male clients who have imposter syndrome. So, I think we all have to work on ourselves, especially now, because after COVID, right, it's hard to leave who you are behind, right? You bring yourself to work more. Your emotions, it's kind of hard. It's almost impossible to put a cap on everything. And we're being told not to. So it's really important that we really work on ourselves so that you're going to feel more competent.
Thank you so much for sharing your additional insight on that, and giving the both sides of the coin there. And so just shifting gears a little, right? So as someone who has built a successful business and practice, who is now, building phase two of her career and her business, as you look back and to that earlier version of Suzanne, who was just taking the leap of faith, who was, learning who she was, and dealing with all of her of her trauma and imposter syndrome. What are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned, not just necessarily in building the business, but in becoming and embodying a leader in this space?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is that, we each have our own skills, our own qualities, our own style, and to value that. Even if you have the same message, who you are, your voice, it's all going to be important and valuable, and not to criticize and judge yourself. That you're not to compare so much, that you're not as good as this person or that person. And I learned this about myself. If I have this desire to do this, it's for a reason. It's because it's my purpose, and that we're all here for a reason and for a certain purpose. And if we follow that, then we're going to keep growing. That's kind of what I'm learning. So I'm not questioning as much about, well, do I really want to do this? I'm just learning that even if it seems risky, I think I'm supposed to do it as a way to grow. The other thing that I learned in terms of my journey is that we all have insecurities, and that's really normal. And the best thing to do is to get a lot of support, like to join networks, to listen to podcasts, read books, really understand what it means to be an entrepreneur, and how that you're not really alone. A lot of people go through the same thing, and it's a process. So getting support is so important. And I never realized that as much as I did once until I became an entrepreneur.
Thank you for sharing those. All of the points are really, really important. But that last point around the fact that we all have insecurities, right? We're all learning, we're all growing, we're all figuring out life, as life unfolds. And I think that that's important to highlight, especially in this day and age where, everyone only shows the highlight reels. They only show the successes and the wins. That at the end of the day, we're still all human, and we still all battle our own, challenges. So that reminder can really help level set our expectations of ourselves and our expectations of others. So thank you so much for sharing that. This has been so valuable for me. I can geek out on this for hours, but I know you don't have hours. Just a couple questions for you. So in terms of what you're working on and how you support your clients, if the listeners are listening and they've thought, oh my gosh, I need support, I need help.
People can find me on my website, SuzanneMcCollLLC.com. And I have all sorts of resources on there, like free courses, articles, things that are all about imposter syndrome and other kinds of issues that entrepreneurs have. And I also have several different kinds of packages, but I have a breakthrough session. If people are interested and they want to give me a call and just do one session that they can kind of look at what they're doing in their life, what their past issues might have been, and how they kind of fit in together, and then what to do about it. So you can find that on my website. And I'm on, every social media, Suzanne McColl, LPC. You can find me LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. I'll be sure to link the website as well as all of your handles and the link to the breakthrough session. And one question that I always ask my guests, because I am a firm believer that leaders are readers. As you think about, books that you've read, are there any that, really stand out for you or really been helpful in your journey towards overcoming imposter syndrome?
I really like What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Perry, because it really links how a person might be feeling in the here and now with what happened to them in the past. Mm-hmm. So I highly recommend that.
I've actually never heard of that one. So I will definitely be linking it in the show notes and adding it to my Audible. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So as we wrap up and I turn you loose to the rest of the world who needs you, any final thoughts, anything that you want to share with the audience as words of encouragement?
Just that, if you have imposter syndrome, or if you're struggling with not feeling good enough, these are all just beliefs that you have from the past. You can get over them. You can shift them to feeling really positive and empowered, and don't settle for feeling not good enough.
Amazing words of wisdom. Suzanne, thank you so much for coming on the show, for, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your vulnerability in terms of your own process, and certainly the inspiration. And for the listeners, hopefully you got some nuggets from this. Please be sure to connect with Suzanne on her social handles as well as on her website and schedule one of those breakthrough sessions if you need it. With that, I will chat with you next week. Until then, have a great rest of the week. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of She Leads Now. Be sure to join us next week for another transformative discussion to help you grow, develop, and embody the courageous leader you've always been. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get alerts when new episodes drop, and join us for our next Leaders Lounge meetup on Zoom. Details and dates for future sessions are included in the show notes below, so take a look there or head over to sabinegideon.com/lounge to register and hold your spot for the next session. Again, that's sabinegideon.com/lounge to grab your spot. Excited to connect with you all inside the lounge. Talk to you soon.